Hello, how are you?
Hi there.
Greetings from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina.
Well, so far it's working.
Excellent.
I was watching, they had some silent films on TCM this morning, and I don't generally watch them, but
Oh,
started watching The Wind
oh
with
yeah,
Lillian Gish.
yeah.
And
What a great movie, huh?
yeah, and I had to TiVo the end. I had to leave.
Right.
But yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, I wrote an article about The Wind.
Yeah,
It was remade.
basic facial expressions.
Uh,
The
yeah,
eyes
the
open.
silent cinema is mostly close-ups.
Yeah.
I'll have to see if I can find the essay I wrote about The Wind. It was remade into a horror movie in 2019 by a feminist director.
Really?
Yeah. Let's see. So I dropped the file into the chat. Can you download the file from there? If you open the chat.
Where's my chat? Let's see if I can do that successfully.
Okay.
It looks like I can.
Yep. So yeah, instead of the nature from the Victor Seastrom silent film, it's supernatural. So the loneliness of the prairie, instead of the windstorm, becomes this kind of supernatural beast that sort of assaults the house. But yeah, it's the same plot structure as The Wind, and it's also called The Wind. And what's remarkable is that none of the critics who reviewed the film when it came out actually knew that it was a reworking of the
Really?
movie that you watched this morning, which in film studies, bless you, is an incredibly well-known film that when you ask a film scholar to teach late silent cinema, American silent cinema, as like the great art form of cinema that was ruined by the coming of sound, there's only a handful of films that people choose. They choose The Wind, another Victor Seastrom film with Lillian Gish, The Scarlet Letter. She's in a Scarlet Letter adaptation. Probably most people would choose F.W. Murnau's Sunrise. So Murnau shot German expressionist films and then came to the United States. I choose The Crowd, this film by King Vidor. Most of these films were made between 1926 and 1928. And so, for example, when sound came, Chaplin thought it was a disaster. So his first sound film actually makes fun of early sound recording. It's City Lights from 1931, which is incredibly late. The Jazz Singer is
I
19
think that was
October
on this, that was on after, I think, this morning.
Yeah. So the opening of City Lights is the town fathers are celebrating how great their city is, so they're unveiling a statue. And when they speak, given this kind of pompous speech, Chaplin has all the voices sound like kazoos, so all the people talk through kazoos. And the joke is that very early film sound recording was virtually indecipherable when it came to dialogue. You couldn't really understand what people were saying. So that's the joke in the in City Lights. And then of course, Chaplin went on to make amazing talking films, culminating in The Great Dictator in the early 40s, and then was essentially booted out of the country because of the HUAC anti-communist stuff, and made most of his films in exile in the 1950s. The most famous of which is Monsieur Verdoux, which is about a guy who kills his wives. It's a beautiful film, but they were made in Britain. All right, well, it's 12:31. There's only 3 people here. I wonder why that is.
1, 2, 3, 4. I have 4 on my list.
Right. Oh yeah, I see. Wait, this says 2:27. Is it 2:31 or
131.
1:31 your time, right? Yeah. Okay. And if it gets too loud, so you hear background noise, let me know. About 12 of my college friends and their families are in the other room. So we've got a house full of people Zooming from every room because, you know, we're all doing our jobs in addition to being on vacation. I just ran off the golf course. We're 2 blocks from the beach.
I had to teach for over a year on Zoom.
Yeah.
So we were teaching students in Japan. So we
Oh.
were teaching class at 6 in the morning.
Right.
Not a good experience.
Yeah, it's really difficult. So we couldn't get our doctoral students in during the pandemic.
Mhm.
And so for a afternoon class, we teach our grad students after 3 o'clock so they can be teaching assistants during the day. The student in India, I think, had a start class at 4 a.m.
Mm.
And we had a student in Italy. And unless you had the class in the morning, that was like, you know, midnight. And then we had a student in Myanmar. It was just like,
Mhm.
there was no way you could schedule a time when, because we have an international graduate program. We got people
Yeah.
strewn across the world even before the pandemic. But during the pandemic, those students could not get visa appointments in the country to get here to the United States.
Well, you
So
can
we-
imagine an English as a second language program where you can't get students into the country.
Yeah, that
So
might be a
you have
problem.
to- Yeah, so they're still teaching, they have evening classes and they have early morning classes.
Right, yeah. All right, well, let's get started. We're on day 3 of the worldwide tour of feminist film studies. Let me open up the screen here. We can reflect on where we are and where we're headed. So this is day 3 of 5. Day 1 was the pre-cinema formulation of how you might approach women making culture, women being represented in culture. So Greek comedy, Greek tragedy, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, melodrama. My essay about Bridges in Madison County is meant to serve as a model for how do you do film analysis more generally, directed at a film where I use feminist psychoanalysis to read the film, but also use aesthetic analysis. So Meryl Streep and Clint Eastwood don't belong in a movie together. And so Meryl Streep starts to take over the movie. I just watched, I don't know if you watched it, but the Mule is Clint Eastwood's latest film. I guess HBO released last Friday. He's essentially been developing this role since that movie, sort of discarding the I'm a tough, dirty Harry guy into some complex representation of masculinity that attempts to still be a tough guy, but one who's inserted in a world where masculinity is highly destabilized. So I published an essay about blood work, where he has a heart attack and he can't beat people up anymore because he's recovering from heart surgery. And the Mule is very much like this. He essentially plays an old version of the guy he used to play in the 70s, Every Which Way But Loose, Bronco Billy. So he's a retired rodeo star, and his boss, who's really been helping him stay alive for the last 20 years, sends him to Mexico to rescue his son. And there's a kind of way in which these Eastwood films are softly interrogating the nature of masculinity. And of course, Meryl Streep, as a second wave feminist, takes this relatively sexist material from the Robert James Waller novel and starts interfering in the script in wonderfully feminist ways. A little bit later in the class, we'll get to the moment where she does that with Kramer versus Kramer. And so there's a really nice essay about Meryl Streep's role in screwing up the film adaptation of Kramer versus Kramer, which is one of these late 70s, early 80s backlash films. It essentially begins where Henrik Ibsen's Dollhouse leaves off. At the end of Dollhouse, Nora leaves her husband to find out who she is. At the beginning of Kramer versus Kramer from 1979, based on this novel, I'd probably published the year before. In the film, the father, played by Dustin Hoffman, his wife, played by Meryl Streep, leaves him at the beginning of the movie. So literally starts where Doll's House leaves off. And then she changes her mind and she wants the kid back, and it's a courtroom narrative with, you know, a bullshit anti-feminist ending. Dustin Hoffman becomes a really good dad. And then Meryl Streep comes back, and the film sees the legal system in opposition to men's rights. And so the way my conservative mother put it, they always give the kid to the mother. And there's these two films that win the Best Academy Award for Best Picture, Kramer versus Kramer in 1979, and Ordinary People, Robert Redford's first directorial effort. And they'll both have the same plot. Men make better mothers and men make better women is sort of the way in which these films position the feminist movement. Anyway, so you build an argument about the meaning of film by taking aesthetic and narrative observations. So in Birds of Madison County, Francesca lives in Iowa in the 1950s, and no one takes her seriously as a person. The daughter changes the radio station. The husband and son come out of the farm and they slam the door, scaring her to death. And there's a kitchen, and she's always seated in the seat right next to the stove so that she can access the food. And the obnoxious kids and husband are seated near the door so they can abandon her whenever they want. So Clint Eastwood shows up and they have an affair while the family's off at the state fair. And Clint Eastwood gradually takes Francesca's seat next to the stove, and Francesca starts moving away from her role as mother as she has the affair. So this is an aesthetic observation, like who sits in what chair. In film criticism, this is known as mise-en-scène criticism. Comes from the 19th century theater. Putting on the stage is literally what it means translated from French. So where do you put the chair? Where do you put the couch in a doll's house when you're staging a doll's house as a play? In a film, what are the character relationships to each other? What are the relationships between characters and objects? So the chairs, the dining room table, the stove. So you start making an argument about aesthetics, just basic observations about what the image looks like and what the sound sounds like. And then you've been inserting where those aesthetic interventions are related narratively. So in the first act of Bridges, Francesca is associated with the stove. In the second act, as her life is transformed by this affair with Robert, the aesthetic practices change. And what we usually say is that the aesthetics are transformed across the turning points in a Hollywood narrative. So there's 3 acts in a Hollywood movie: exposition, development, resolution. The turning points are the transitions between the acts. So the first turning point is the transformation from the expository act to the developmental act. So the second act of the Bridges of Madison County is the affair. And as you track the transformation of who sits in what chair throughout the second act, Francesca gravitates away from the stove and Robert displaces her by sitting in her chair near the stove. So the aesthetic practices of a Hollywood film that's well made are transforming based on narrative location. And then the next thing you do, because you're leading towards some kind of ideological or thematic analysis. So who cares who sits in what chair? And this is ultimately an ideological argument that the Robert James Waller novel sort of celebrates how great Robert is for swooping into Francesca's life and transforming it. In the film, because it's Meryl Streep, it's much more interested in the transformation Meryl Streep is undergoing, which is not unrelated to the affair with Robert, but it's not sort of celebrated in some kind of creepy way as it is in the novel, told from the point of view of Robert, because Robert James Waller, who wrote the novel, clearly conceives of himself as Robert in the novel. At any rate, the formula I usually use to summarize this for the students is aesthetics plus narrative equals thematic ideological argument. Aesthetics and narrative location are the building blocks out of which you build an argument. And then on top of that, you layer theoretical interventions. So in the case of this entire course, there's feminist theory. Like, how do we think of gender and why do we think of gender? How do we define gender concepts? Essentialism. Are men and women inherently different, genetically, socially? So a concept like essentialism is a theoretical principle. Some people, radical feminists in the 70s, argue the world would be better if it was run by women. And that's just an essentialist argument. It thinks that there's something about being a woman, whether it's genetic or socially constructed, that would make women better at running governments. And a non-essentialist, which is what most theoretical positions have moved to since radical feminism and simplistic patriarchy before it, are that, well, sometimes women are good at running countries. Like Angela Merkel's probably the best leader in Europe. But maybe sometimes not. Like maybe Evita Peron was not a great leader compared to, Franklin Roosevelt. So in the Bridges essay, I fold in these theoretical interventions that feminist analysis of movies is based on psychoanalysis. So it's a lot of Freud. And what I attempt to do is displace the psychoanalytic nature of Freud So the Oedipal complex, the way in which women are not sutured into language and men are sutured in language. These are all sort of basic psychoanalytic principles, which of course are built on quicksand, that if you take a course in psychology, there's a sidebar about there once was this guy, Sigmund Freud, but we're experimental psychologists and we actually use data and, you know, have analyses that are done with n's of 10,000. You know, real social science. Freud built the argument for the Acani out of 6 Viennese middle-class women. It's a beautiful essay, it's very smart, but it's more literary criticism than it is science. And so what I do is I use the literary components of Freudian analysis against this feminist reduction of psychoanalytic method. So the joke book and its relation to the unconscious, I sort of cheekily used to explain Francesca's joking, you know, the scene where she's like, oh, these flowers are very nice that you gave me, Robert, but they're poisonous. And then he drops them and she starts laughing. Freud is pretty good for describing that. It's a tendentious joke. It's a political joke made at his expense. And then Mourning and Melancholia, this 1917 Freud essay, which is really quite beautiful. It makes the argument that a person who properly processes the death of a loved object mourns, acknowledges that the person is gone, and goes through a healthy process. And then of course, Freud is interested in defining and treating neurotics, like what happens when these normal processes go wrong. And his name for that is melancholia, the refusal to let the lost loved object go. And so in the essay, I try to propose that you could use Mourning and Melancholia as a reading frame for both what the son and daughter are doing by learning about their mother. The son refuses to accept the truth about his mother, that she had an affair. The daughter is much more receptive to this. So they've lost their mother. They're in a state of mourning, purportedly. But the son is in a state of melancholia because he's confronted with the fact that he can't mourn his mother because he doesn't know who his mother was. And then the fact that Francesca has kept this trunk of all this Robert Kincaid stuff without telling her family could be seen as Francesca herself as a melancholic. What the kids discover is that she's preserved all these moments from that affair, that 3-day affair she had with Robert. And it could be that she's a melancholic because she's repressed happiness, that moment when in the rain, she can make the decision to leave the truck with her husband and go run to Robert, and she doesn't. And so she could just mourn him, that is, tell people, not her husband probably, but to get it out of her system, but she doesn't. She internalizes everything in that little trunk. And I think Freud is a pretty useful theoretical tool for understanding Francesca as a melancholic. So this is a feminist essay because it's interested in centering Francesca. I think because of Meryl Streep, but also because of Clint Eastwood's transformation from a action filmmaker about tough guys to a filmmaker who's really interested in the unstable nature of masculinity from the 1970s onward. It's useful to think about Bridges of Madison County as a feminist film, or in the case of this course, as a chick flick. So that just sets up a reading frame, like what are we going to do with these films? And then last week, a trajectory of films. Once you start film history, what is the role of women in early film. So until the institution of classical Hollywood studio filmmaking, efficiency, Fordist and Taylorist modes of minimizing costs and maximizing profits, women were allowed to do all kinds of stuff in the film industry. Alice Guy Blaché ran her own film studio in New Jersey. Lois Weber was the highest paid film director in the teens. And then these filmmakers make all these wonderful films. So a film like How Men Propose. So 1913, this is simultaneous to D.W. Griffith moving from 6 reel films of an hour to The Birth of a Nation, 1914, which is this massive 3-hour film that traditional film studies celebrated as the film that invented film, which turns out not to be true at all. You know, and it's based on a white supremacist novel, Thomas Dixon's The Klansman. So to build film history on the base of this really racist film might be a problem. And so feminist film historians of the 1980s began to say things like, well, what if we built film history at that moment out of a film other than Birth of a Nation? And so How Men Propose from 1913 made simultaneously to the 2 last Griffith 6-reelers, one of which is a biblical film, Judith of Bethulia, also about a central female protagonist. But this is a comedy, and so very different from that kind of grandiose Griffith filmmaking. You know, Birth of a Nation is about how horrible Reconstruction was, which is preposterous. It's one of the chances the United States had to repair the damage of slavery and failed to do so. So there's this woman, and she's dating 3 men, but the other men don't know that that's going on. And they finally find out that she's been dating all 3. And I'll show you that moment forward. So she's given her picture to each of these men separately. And we don't know anything about it. All we know is these men keep showing up at her house. And then in what we think is a joke, she invites them over, but she's not there. She leaves a letter behind. And the guys all realize that she's given the photo and these sort of love affections to all 3 of them. And this is the comic end of the movie. So ways in which one teaches how to do what I do is to put these kinds of texts in play and then refer back to what we already know. So does anyone take a crack at how this film as a chick flick relates to the pre-cinematic history of gender relations in narrative art? Can you think of ways in which this relates with the stuff we've already studied? So there's no one right answer, but here's what I might suggest. New comedy is built out of a set of conflicts. The three conflicts were generational. So the new comedy, Old Cantankerous from the 4th century BC. The closest equivalent in our world is something like Sanford and Son, where Fred Sanford doesn't want his son Lamont to leave him, so he's constantly subverting Lamont's love life, is one conflict. The Battle of the Sexes is another conflict. Usually it's, men versus women, Lysistrata, Aristophanes' Old Comedy. The men and the women are engaged in warfare with each other. Literally in Lysistrata, the women are trying to end the Peloponnesian War, and the guys think it's perfectly normal to kill each other all the time. And then the master-slave conflict is the third of the ancient Greek comedy conflicts. What's remarkable about that, it's usually in the ancient Greek plays, the slave or the lower class person more generally across history is in collusion with the young lovers who we identify with. And the villain is always the rich aristocrat. But in How Men Propose, Grace, the sociologist, the journalist who's doing this secret study about how weird men are, is in cahoots with her maid. So the maid is actually allowing her to engage in this feminist project. So she's the one that Grace leaves the letters with. So she's actually the one present when the joke is played on the men. And then the remarkable formulation of this is that it's comedy. I was only playing. And so there are other films from this period that one might choose. Alice Guy Blaché produced a film about abortion politics in 1914 that will be extremely significant as the Trump court dismantles Roe versus Wade. So you could do a similar kind of tragedy analysis, but this is a comedy analysis. Lois Weber is messing around with the history of comedy by having the master-slave dynamic not be one of mere collusion between the working class and the lovers, but here a collusion between the working class maid and this weird sociologist. Like, why Grace Darling's a sociologist in 1914, we don't know, but one suspects that Lois Weber has written this film so that she can understand her own position in the culture. And on the 5th day of the class, at the end, I do this thing, Women in the Professions, that calls back to this. The best essay in film studies about this is Legally Blonde, where this kind of dippy girl goes to Harvard Law School and ends up being a much better lawyer than these snoots that are seen to be really great law students. And in fact, there's interesting films about women entering all kinds of different professions. I don't know, Erin Brockovich as an activist, environmental activist. There's a bunch of films where women characters engage in things that usually in a Western only guys get to do. They get to control and intervene in the plot structure. So one lesson this tells you is the lesson that I used to begin the course. To understand how men propose, you first have to understand ancient Greek comedy. And then we notice that all these historical moments, all kinds of armature is being used to change the culture. So liberal feminism of the 1960s and the 1970s, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, and Gloria Steinem's founding of Ms. Magazine are fueling particular cultural responses, backlash to feminism. Susan Faludi's Backlash is a study of Reagan-era policies to dismantle feminism. So this is how you build these kinds of encounters, that Grace Darling's playing is related to the women in Aristophanes' Lysistrata saying, I wonder if we could use traditional notions of sex to stop the Peloponnesian War, and they do. So Grace Darling learns a lot, and we assume goes off to write this journalism article, and the women in Lysistrata and the Peloponnesian War. Okay, so the way you build these arguments is you trace historically what's going on at any given moment in relationship to feminist history. So these films chosen in this lecture, Women in Early Cinema, are interested in the historical facts. Hollywood became more sexist the more efficient it became. So women were not allowed to direct movies after 1917. Only 2 women direct a Hollywood film feature between 1917 and 1960. Dorothy Arzner, who's the most important, talk about her in a minute, and Ida Lupino. Ida Lupino only because she's married to a very important film producer, Walter Wanger. And Wanger, as a producer, hires directors, and when one of the directors would crap out on him, commit to directing a film and then suddenly not show up for work, he would say to his wife, hey, you want to direct a movie? And she directed astonishing movies, the most important of which is The Bigamist. But it's of some significance throughout the entire history of what we call classical Hollywood cinema. That is when filmmaking stabilizes in the United States into this Fordist efficient system. And that happens fully stabilized by 1917. And then up until the moment that it starts to break down, somewhere around 1960. 1960 is a relatively arbitrary date, but the full force of the Paramount Decree is in place, that the economics of Hollywood have been ripped apart. Hollywood studios are no longer controlling exhibition. So films from outside the Hollywood system get shown in significant numbers in the 1960s, particularly international art cinema, where there are female directors. Agnes Varda is part of the Left Bank French from the early 60s. Independent films. I'm going to show you some feminist films from the 70s. So the films of this period, the teens, are made at the moment when the so-called first wave of American feminism is developing and about to produce a grandiose victory. The 19th Amendment, which grants women the right to vote, passed in 1920. So what you have here are comparisons between suffragette era Hollywood films, How Men Propose, and then Griffith films, which are not particularly feminist. Although I want you to notice that these arguments are not reductive. It's not Lois Weber is a great filmmaker because she's a woman, and D.W. Griffith is a horrible filmmaker because he's a man. Instead, what we can say is that patriarchy generally produces the privileging of male filmmakers who mostly press for patriarchal ideology, and female filmmakers sometimes press against it, not always. So for example, here's a Griffith film, 1911, Lone-Dale Operator. It's about a woman who's married to a guy who works on the train, and her father runs the telegraph office. The history of the telegraph and the railroad's really interesting. They're tied together. So the transcontinental telegraph lines are laid in 1858, before the Civil War. And the railroad is completed in 1868 after the Civil War. So I don't know if you've seen the Will Smith movie Wild Wild West. They lay the spike at Promontory Point in Utah, which connects the Transcontinental Railroad. Ulysses Grant is the president that shows up in that scene. So the telegraph unifies the nation before the railroad, which is surprising. It's one of the foundational things that we say in mass communication. The telegraph is more important than the railroad, which if you're a transportation historian, you wouldn't say. But the telegraph is the place that you would normally start the history of mass communication. It separates transportation from communication for the very first time. There's some pre-historical examples. Smoke signals kind of does that. But the telegraph on a mass scale means that you can communicate with someone without moving. So that's not the mail. So the telegraph kills off the Pony Express. So the Pony Express is the last example of a communication system that is directly linked to transportation, right? I send you a letter with a guy on a horse. So you have to transmit the letter from one place to another. And you see the inefficiencies with it. It's slow. The horse can have a heart attack and the letter never gets there. The rider goes in the wrong direction. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong. That's not the case with the telegraph. You can send a telegraph message because of the power of copper wire transmitting information with electrons from New York to San Francisco virtually instantaneously. And the signal can't get lost because it's down telegraph lines. So the Lone-Dale Operator from the early point in the history of cinema is about this woman who works as the telegraph operator because her husband and father run the train line back and forth and have trained her to do the telegraph stuff. So when they're out running the train, she's running the telegraph. As in many of these Griffith last-minute chase rescue melodramas, she's left alone and some evil guys want to steal the money in the telegraph office, and she's left alone. So she uses the telegraph to summon the men back on the train, and it's a race between the evil guys getting into stealing the money and we assume hurting her, and the guy's getting back to rescue her. That's why one of the prehistorical things that I discuss in the class is melodrama. This is a melodrama. There's evil guys who want to hurt her. There's good guys, the husband and the father, who want to protect her, but they're in different places. So Griffith cuts back and forth, and we get a suspenseful experience with the movie because we want to know whether the husband and father can get to her before the tramps can get there, the criminals. And so she telegraphs, there's some guys trying to attack me. And they get the information to the husband and the father. And so they rush to rescue her. Lone Opera is interested for all kinds of interesting things, one of which is vat dyeing. So we think of color as a 1930s thing. So if you've seen late 30s movies, they're Technicolor film processing. So my dad's favorite film was The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn from 1938. That is a high gloss Technicolor film. Of course, the most famous films from the 1930s are Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz theorizes the nature of color film as grandiose Oz and Kansas as boring black and white. But other processes for delivering color in film existed since the birth of cinema. The most batshit crazy one is hand coloring films. So Méliès films from 1902, you hire a big factory of people and they take every film frame and they use colored pencils to color in the image. This is vat dyeing. You take the entire film strip and you dip it. And so you see here the normal lighting and use of black and white film stock produces this image. So it's supposed to be when light exists, outside, inside, the light's on. Then when there's not much light, it's dyed blue. So this entire film stock was dipped in blue dye. So we know that it's getting late in the day. They better get home before it gets dark. And then the red dye indicates action. Hey, you're supposed to get all excited. Are they going to get home in time? So these become conventions of how color film is developed. And the dye imbibition processes that would eventually lead to the color films you know in the 30s are experimented with in the 20s and are slowly deployed throughout the 1930s. The first fully color film released in Hollywood using not vat dyeing or hand coloring is Becky Sharp, an adaptation of a William Makepeace Thackeray novel, 1936. And so between 1936 and 1939, you get this massive attachment to color. But color is only being used for really important films like Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. In the early 1940s, because of the war, those materials are withheld. There's only one color film, for example, in Britain during World War II. It's Laurence Olivier's Henry V, 1943, and the government of Britain decided we should give Olivier this money because Henry V is essentially a narrative about the British invading France and winning. So if you know Henry V, he invades Normandy and conquers the French. It's a famous battle in the history of military technology. The British, because they come over on boats, are vastly outnumbered by the French, who are defending on home soil. but the British have longbows, and the longbows are powerful enough to shoot arrows that pierce French armor. And that's why Henry V wins the battle. It's essentially a rape narrative. He essentially captures Catherine, the French king's daughter, and has sex with her. It's a very weird, disturbing, fascinating scene from the fourth act of Shakespeare's Henry V. But the point of it is that from the British point of view, Henry's a hero. He successfully leads an invasion of the continent and wins and takes over France. So as you can imagine, in 1943, it's like a pep talk movie. D-Day is being secretly planned, but I'm sure it's not secret that the only way you're going to defeat the Nazis is get soldiers from the United States and Britain back onto the continent. And so that's why the British government allows Olivier the big budget enough to produce a color film. But that's the only color film made in Britain until the end of World War II. And then, of course, you get a flourishing of color films. So if you're interested in British films, the Archers, Howell and Pressburger make all these beautiful color films. When I taught the opera and cinema class with Benyas, Offenbach's Tales of Hoffmann is a beautiful Powell and Pressburger film. The Red Shoes is probably the film everyone knows, but really beautiful Technicolor films in the 50s. In the United States, right, you get film noir shot in black and white, but you get these glorious Technicolor films. And in the case of the chick flicks class, they're the way Douglas Sirk uses color. I guess I'll get there in a minute. But this is how you build an argument. And notice that the history of color is not inconsequential to how you would talk about feminist film. That you can't talk about feminist film without the film part, and you can't talk about with the feminism part. So I just went on a weird 12-minute digression about the history of color, but it allows you to talk about the Lone-Dale Operator in relationship with the Weber films, which are not colored. Anyway, so you get to the end of this film. Oh, showing you the wrong thing. You get to the end of this film, and it's a last-minute rescue. In 80% of the Griffith films, it's a happy ending. In 20%, it's not a happy ending. The most important non-happy ending is Death's Marathon on the short level. In the feature, Griffith films are essentially a strung together set of last-minute rescue sequences. Birth of a Nation has two important last-minute rescues, one of which is a failure and one of which is a success. So the famous Gus chase sequence, the hero woman of the melodrama jumps off a cliff rather than be attacked by this black man, not actually a black man, a white guy played in blackface to be a villain. And the ending of Birth of a Nation is this triumphant celebration of white supremacy, that the Ku Klux Klan is formed, and they ride to the rescue to rescue white people. And that's the transcendent ending of the film that we're supposed to all cheer. Birth of a Nation ends with the establishment of the Christly world of the United States as essentially the divine articulation of Christianity. America is the city on the hill, and it just so happens that the people in the city are white people and the people who threaten the city are black people. All right, so Lone-Dale Operator is a film that has a successful last-minute rescue. The guys get there in time. But I want you to notice the feminist dynamics of why the guys get there on time And it has to do with the inventiveness of the central female protagonist. She's not the passive victim that you see in the Dudley Do-Right triangular melodrama, right? You must pay the rent. I can't pay the rent. I'll pay the rent. That the I can't pay the rent woman actually does stuff. And it's quite clever. And the reason this is important is because these identity politics interventions tend to want to be reductionist. Is the movie feminist or not is a stupid question. Most movies are what Fredric Jameson calls a melange of positive and negative hermeneutics. That sensible people want women and men to be treated with equity and with justice. So that's the positive hermeneutic, like what things happen in movies that support that. And there's a negative hermeneutic. Most movies, some of which are made by feminists and most of which are not forwarding ideas that would lead to liberation or equity. So clearly How Men Propose, Lois Weber, is a kind of celebration of women's interaction with the world that they've been told not to interact with. So we don't know why Grace is a sociologist journalist, but it's delightful that she is. And here's how Lone-Dale Operator ends. So Griffith is a weird Kentucky-based son of slave owners who seems to believe white supremacy is a good idea, and making traditional melodramas where women are passive and men are active. But look at the way in which this movie is nuanced. I wouldn't position D.W. Griffith as a feminist, but I would say if you want to understand the way in which women and feminism appear in Hollywood films, this is kind of an important thing to know. And that's nuance. And it's nuance that is not being articulated well in the culture. Critical race theory, are you for it or are you against it? And you read these things in the New York Times, and that's how things split. And it just doesn't make sense. So I'm more or less for the smart application of critical race theory for understanding American racism. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to say critical things about it, particularly when it goes off the rails. And we live in a kind of cancel culture where the for or again leaves no room for nuance. And so the trigger warning crowd says things like, you shouldn't go show Griffith movies because he was a racist, sexist ass. And my response is, that's precisely why I want to show Griffith movies. And in fact, he's 92% racist, sexist ass, but it is a complete misunderstanding to say that's all he is. Anyway, this is the end of the movie, and one would be hard pressed to say there's not some kind of feminist dynamic to what this woman does. So nuance. That it's still a movie about like the husband and father having to come rescue her. But what allows them to be successful is she comes up with this brilliant idea. She turns off the light and uses the wrench as a gun. It's dark, and she convinces these idiots that she's got a gun. And then the beautiful ending of the movie where the dad makes the villains tip their hats. You're smarter than me. And that's the joy of film history. There's all kinds of stuff buried that people don't talk about. So there's no way the radical academic left is going to scour Griffith films for its feminist moments. And yet that's exactly what one does to tell the full story about the relationship between gender and cinema. And essentially that's what my class does. And so as you proceed through the various encounters, screwball comedy, right? What does it mean that Katharine Hepburn talks really fast? It's both some kind of sexist thing about women are flighty and non-logical, but it's also a critique of, so what does male logic get you? And so the ending of Bringing Up Baby is a kind of celebration, very similar to Battle of the Sexes narratives from New Comedy that end Shakespeare plays and that end sitcoms. Men and women are different, but it's not out of some essentialism. It's about things like social construction that Katharine Hepburn in that film knows how to be in the world as a woman in ways that are different from how Cary Grant knows how to be in the world. And what human relationships do is they allow each other to grow. So Katharine Hepburn, Susan, destroys the Brontosaurus, which seems like a bad thing. But because David is woefully miserable, it's also a liberation that he can now find a balance in the world between just being a professor all the time and doing something else, which is to enjoy the vitality of the world. That what does it mean that Susan is associated with nature? Is the vitality of the world nature, and is that nature feminine? So they have a baby, but the baby is two things at once. It's a vicious leopard that threatens them, but it's also a tamed cat that is a version of nature. It's the zoo version of nature. It's nature tamed. So the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? There's no 10 commandments of feminism that says yes or no. The point of doing theoretical analysis is to try to figure out what things mean. And their meaning is not predetermined, and it's not anything other than argumentative positions. That I'm happier to be in a world where there's bringing up baby, and I can see the way in which you line up bringing up baby in a world that imagines how men and women relate to each other in ways that are better than the way men and women usually relate to each other. So here's another question that you'd get on a test. So there's this bringing up baby business about nature, about gender. What do you study in the prehistory that would allow you to relate that? Bringing up baby to prehistory. Anyone want to take a crack at that?
Oh.
So one of the things that you study Shakespeare for is that the taming of the shrew is related to the taming of the leopard and bringing up baby. That when Catherine delivers this speech at the end of Taming of the Shrew, she's seen as some kind of unbridled force of nature that Petruchio has to tame. And, you know, the way people used to talk about Shakespeare is unnuanced. Well, he's a guy, so these are really sexist plays. They peddle in stereotypes. But feminist revisionist approaches to Shakespeare are like, wait a minute. Catherine's speech at the end of that play is really angry and quite true. So maybe she's not able to be contained. Even though the surface meaning of Taming of the Shrew is, oh, they got married. And that means Kate is going to return to a world of being dominated by men. And Petruchio is one. Nothing in that play indicates that Kate has learned a damn thing. And in fact, the speech indicates something else. That she's inventing a way of pretending to use the language of patriarchy. Yes, I promise that I won't engage in any nonsense that you don't like. But we know damn well from the rest of the play that she could be lying. And that is the cornerstone of my work. So I'll kind of skip out of order here. But what I've just described about bringing up baby, that Susan is in love with David, and they're going to get married and have a traditional life. But it's also true that David has learned a lot from Susan to embrace the irrational, to embrace the chaotic, right? After his dinosaur collapses, he's like, oh, well, and he gives her a hug, and that's the end of the movie. We're led to believe the next thing they do is have sex. That's what people generally do. So think about that in relationship to what I do with the sitcom. So my feminist book in television studies is about Bewitched. Bewitched is a TV show about this woman, Samantha, who's a witch. And she falls in love with a guy, Darren, who's an advertising executive. There's 254 episodes. In every episode, Samantha, Elizabeth Montgomery, or one of Samantha's relatives uses magic to cause trouble, which threatens to expose Darren in the 1960s as aberrant. He can't afford that because he lives in button-down corporate America. To stand out is to be threatened to lose your job. So Samantha always has to use magic to paper over the damage. But notice that it's mostly her family that uses the magic to cause the trouble. Usually the way Samantha solves the problem is not with magic, but coming up with really smart advertising slogans. And her husband is always given praise for them. You're the greatest advertising man we have. And half the ideas are Samantha's. So that's a bit weird. But the A plot of Bewitched, that is the long-term plot, is Samantha says, I'll never use witchcraft because it's too feminine. I want to support you, Darren, because you're the man and you go out and make money at the advertising agency. But in every single episode, the so-called local plot, she lies. She says, I'll never use magic again. And if she were telling the truth, there wouldn't be another episode. So she lies 253 times. And this is again nuance. Like the Shakespeare interpretations, there's a surface reading that would indicate the play's really sexist. It's a negative representation of Catherine. But a slightly more sophisticated, nuanced reading, what lies underneath that is, whoa, not so fast. There's chaos, there's disruption, there's the so-called positive and negative hermeneutic from Jameson. And this is true again and again in Bewitched episodes. And so when she's watching the moon landing, she's running the vacuum cleaner, driving Darren crazy. And he's like, stop doing the housework. Don't you want to watch the moon landing with me? And she's like, I have to clean the house. But she knows everything about the moon landing. She starts talking about elliptical orbits. And so the show is imagining a nuanced world in which Samantha is pressured into being a traditional housewife, but under no circumstances does she seem interested in subsuming herself to that role. She plays lip service to it, but she doesn't stop doing magic. She doesn't stop intervening in the public space. And that is another point of contact that, like Susan in Bringing Up Baby is related to the Taming of the Shrew, Samantha in Bewitched is related to Bringing Up Baby. There's something irrational in Bewitched supernatural about Samantha's intervention to critique patriarchy. It doesn't make Bewitched an inherently feminist show, but it certainly makes Bewitched amenable to feminist readings. And so all my students right now are interested in WandaVision, whose pilot episode is a reconstruction of Bewitched. And indeed, the central character in WandaVision, one of these Marvel TV shows on Disney, is that she's traumatized by the assault on her family. So she builds a sitcom world where the man that she loves is a robot. Vision is the sitcom husband, Darren, and she's the sitcom wife, Wanda. But she's a witch. She's holding this entire artificial world together with her with witch-like powers. It's a very smart show because it says, how would you bring Bewitched into the orbit of the Marvel universe, which you wouldn't associate with feminism particularly. But if you turn Wanda into Bewitched or Samantha in Bewitched, then you've got a very nuanced reconstruction of the history of gender in late 20th century American culture, every bit as nuanced as whatever Shakespeare is doing with gender or whatever Howard Hawks is doing with gender in the screwball comedies of the 1930s. So much of what I do in these classes is summarize other people's work. This is what my work does. I kind of fold that in. Yeah, let me get to today's stuff. So we enter the 1970s. Bewitched is a response to the feminine mystique. Betty Friedan, a journalist, writes this article, Why Are All My Friends on Valium? And one of her interventions is because middle-class women in the United States are not being given access to the same lives as their husbands, And maybe this is a problem. She writes a 300-page book about this. And one of the things I do in my book is I use Betty Friedan's feminine mystique as a motor for reading Bewitched. It's hard to imagine the pilot of Bewitched, September of 1964, without the 1963 publication of Betty Friedan's feminine mystique. And that book and a bunch of other books from the 1960s gives rise to the second wave American feminism, so-called liberal feminism. Like, shouldn't women be paid the same? Shouldn't they have access to the workforce? And then a more radical tradition develops that critiques liberalism, like maybe liberalism doesn't fix the problems that are oppressing women. So you end up with various radical feminist positions. And it leads to more radical films. They can't be made in Hollywood, but they can be made outside of Hollywood. And this is important for academic film studies because there's two ways that people see movies outside of outside of the mainstream movies you can see in movie theaters. One is in museums and one is in film classes. You go to the university and instead of reading Shakespeare plays, you watch movies and television. So there's a set of films motivated not by liberal feminists like Betty Friedan, but motivated by more radical theory. So I had you read a chapter from Lucy Fisher. Lucy Fisher and I are on the TV Milestones board together. We helped co-edit the Wayne State series. So Lucy Fisher's book is called Shot Counter Shot. She links a feminist avant-garde film from the 70s to larger social structures. So you see stuff that we've already studied, Marianne Doan's Desire, right? The medical discourse in Dark Victory. And then she uses feminist theory of the 1970s to understand the relationship between classical Hollywood movies and avant-garde feminist cinema. And one of the things she uses is new French feminism. It's essentialist feminism. Women are more productive for building an egalitarian society than men. Luce Irigaray, The Sexes Which Was Not One, and Hélène Cixous, The Laugh of Medusa, are the two central texts. There's a wonderful essay called New French Feminisms. It's edited by Alice Jardine, a professor of women's studies at Harvard University. Here's my favorite Alice Jardine story. My friend Tom Conley, he's a Derridian film critic. He uses Jacques Derrida, French philosopher, to analyze movies, as do I. I use Jacques Derrida to understand Carl Sagan's Cosmos, which is a course in itself. If you're interested, let me know. I can teach you my science and film course. So Tom Conley's a professor of French literature at Harvard, and he's friends with Alice Jardine. And as you probably know, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon went to Harvard and they wrote the script for Good Will Hunting, right? Robin Williams teaches this math genius. And Matt Damon goes on to be in Saving Private Ryan, the Spielberg movie. And there's a story that the soldiers tell the night before the big battle. And Matt Damon's story is about a character named Alice Jardine. And it's a vicious anti-feminist story. It's about him having sex with this ugly girl before he shipped out to go to World War II. So I saw Saving Private Ryan, didn't really think much about it. So I go to this conference where Tom is delivering a paper, and Tom's funny, he's like 4 feet tall, kind of looks like a little gnome, brilliant as all get out. His Derridian book is called Film Hieroglyphs. He looks at writing that appears in the background of movies and what it might be expressing about the movies more generally. So the last chapter is about film versions of Émile Zola's La Bête Humaine, a naturalist novel. Jean Renoir made a movie in the 1930s about it. And on the train is the train company's logo, which is ETT. But the French word for state is état, ETAT. And so Connolly tracks the way in which the film obsessively is interested in the logo of the train company. And he suggests that using Derridian deconstruction, that Zola's critique of French culture is replicated in Renoir's film, because what we see in the film is the ship of state, the train that is the lifeblood of French life. It's the only way you get around France, get on the train. And that's a Derridian reading that Connolly engages in. So he's given a talk about Saving Private Ryan, and he's calling everyone's attention to the name of the character. She's not named Alice Jardine offhandedly, the way the film presents it. It's a vicious assault by smug Hollywood boys that in a sort of male supremacist culture get to make movies all the time, and women struggle to get movies made all the time. So none of Alice Jardine's students get to make Hollywood films. So he's 4 feet tall and he's behind the podium, and he's like me, but on cocaine. So he's delivering this wonderful diatribe about the sexism of Saving Private Ryan, but all you can see over the podium is his arms waving in the air. It was one of the most funny, but also poignantly important conference papers I ever witnessed. So that's my Alice Jardine story. Anyway, so there's this radical feminism from the 1970s. And what Fisher's book is doing is finding linkages between these experimental films of the 70s that invoke things like Hélène Cixous and movies. So she talks through all these avant-garde movies. And she develops these like beautiful little arguments about what popular movies and the history of feminist movies have to do with one another. So this particular chapter is about a very early Edison film, Fatima. It's a striptease movie. And Takeoff, a radical feminist film of the 1970s. So I'll show you all of Fatima because it's a 1-minute Edison film. And it's a really interesting historical artifact because it was shown in a censored and uncensored version, which in fact has historical analogs. So Fatima performed at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. She was the most famous burlesque dancer in the 1890s. And Edison shot a lot of vaudeville acts. And so 1896, this is very early in the history of cinema. The Lumieres have just premiered the cinematograph films in Paris in late 1895. Edison's kinetograph was invented in the early 1890s, premiered at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And then he sets up a studio, the Black Maria in New Jersey. And these are the kinds of things they're shooting. They make some fiction films, but mostly it's recording of vaudeville acts. And so it's a relatively straightforward recording of Fatima's sexy burlesque dance. So you get the idea. Generally 55 seconds of film stock. This is 40 seconds. The way films were sold is they were sold to exhibitors by the foot. So you ordered X number of feet of Edison film, and then the exhibitor looked through all the stuff and packaged it however they wanted. This was done throughout the history of classical Hollywood cinema. My friend Steve Carr writes about the packaging of the Holocaust footage. There's some 100-some hours of Holocaust footage. The Soviets, the Nazis' own film images, the US soldiers. And that was sent back to the United States, processed, and then released to movie theaters. But how it was edited was in fact incredibly locally determined. And so this footage kept getting re-edited. And in fact, it continues to be edited to this day. When you watch a Holocaust documentary on A&E, it's the same 100 hours of footage. Like you can't find new Holocaust footage. It's all the same, just repackaged. So my friend Steve's second book is about what records do we have about how people in newsreel houses process this footage? Like, what was this print in New York and what was that print in Chicago? And were they different? Who made these decisions? So the Fatima footage is sent to exhibitors in two versions, a censored version and an uncensored version. This is the uncensored version. So I suppose if you lived in Lower Manhattan, I don't know, whatever the equivalent of Soho is in 1896, I suppose you watch the uncensored version. I think probably if you lived in rural Alabama, you probably got the censored version, which is this, which is funny and ridiculous. She dances behind a fence. And I teach a course on censorship, and there's modern equivalents of this. There's the Todd Solondz film Storytelling that has a censored sequence that's almost identical, using essentially a gate to keep you from seeing a sex scene. So Lucy's argument is there's a relationship between Fatima, a conventional, quote unquote, non-feminist film, and a 1970s feminist film. So this is Gunvar Nelson's Takeoff. It's 10 minutes, made in the early 70s. And I'll scrub through it. It's actually delightful to watch. If you want any of these things, let me know. I'll send you the echo links. It's very kind of hippy dippy. So Magda is in fact a stripper. I think Gunvor Nelson is from Sweden, Norway, one of those liberal Scandinavian countries. So it begins with a film record of Magda doing a striptease, very much like her act. She starts taking clothes off. Lots of burlesque teasing. So up until now, nothing to indicate it's a feminist movie, very much like Fatima. Like, here's a performer, she engages in sex work. Fatima did that in 1896. Magda does this in the 1960s. And then the film takes an extraordinary turn right at the moment of the sort of payoff. Of the culmination of what a striptease is. Like, once the woman's clothes are all off, that's pretty much the end of the striptease. And this happens. It's a remarkable thing. It's one of the most exciting things I ever saw in a movie theater. Because you think you know what the film is, and then suddenly becomes something totally different. And the point of Fisher's analysis is that if you understand the sexist base of the striptease movie, you understand better the feminist assault on that tradition at the end of Takeoff. And if you've read any of the parts of my engaging film criticism, essentially what I do in that book, the method is stolen directly from Lucy's book. Lucy's book is there are pre-existing movies from the birth of cinema through classical cinema that get re-articulated in the present. And my book, Engaging Film Criticism, about how 1990s movies relate to classical Hollywood movies. So there's a chapter on Sling Blade as a reworking of To Kill a Mockingbird. There's a chapter on Wild Wild West, Will Smith, and Buster Keaton's The General. So this is Fisher's feminist methodology. Fatima is being used as a reading frame. We know what sexist patriarchal striptease movies do, and instead this is what we get. So it's an experience. It takes some processing. There's all kinds of frames you can use to think about it. It's a film that begins very narrowly as a striptease film, and suddenly it's 2001, right? Like it ends in outer space with some kind of transformation of the human. But from a feminist point of view, the most important thing is that a psychoanalytic understanding of male desire is that it fetishizes the women's body. It's interested in certain parts and not other parts. So all these sexist formulations that you hear from men in locker rooms. Are you a breast man or a leg man? This kind of patriarchal horseshit. And that's replicated in the history of cinema. Most cinema not only doesn't question that formulation as sexist, but it relies on it. So the movie suckers you in to take it all off. We want to see vaginas, we want to see breasts. And then the shocking thing is hair comes off. And we're like, well, that's weird. But then we're like, well, I get it. Women wear wigs because there's a certain kind of hair that one can grow, and there's the kind of hair one can't grow. So we buy a wig. But then when she removes her leg and throws it off into space, then something quite remarkable happens. And this is fully driven by feminist psychoanalysis. Fetishism, as Freud defines it, is I know women are anatomically different than me, man, but I pretend that that's not the case. And so the prime example of this is Hitchcock's Vertigo. I'll just show you the credit sequence. So if you haven't seen Hitchcock's Vertigo, 1958, Hitchcock's Vertigo is the most studied film in film studies. And in particular, if you're interested in women, film, and feminism, it'd be like trying to study biology and I don't know, not knowing what carbon is. It's really difficult to understand, carbohydrates without understanding the nature of carbon. So the credit sequence of Vertigo is a fetishized presentation of Kim Novak's body, at least Kim Novak's body double. And I want you to think about how close this is to Takeoff. But this is not a hippy-dippy late 60s feminist movie about the dismantling of the women's body. This is a movie that attempts to be a mainstream Hollywood movie. Now, it fails miserably. Vertigo is one of the so-called Universal Five. These were films that were locked in a vault until the 1980s because their releases were so disastrous. And it's hard to describe an equivalent to Vertigo in the history of art. The closest I can come to is Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Written in 1851 as an anti-slavery novel, Melville dies in poverty. The book was, I don't know, printed 500 print copies, 400 of which didn't sell. And in the 1920s, people were like, oh my God, Moby Dick is one of the most important novels of the 19th century because it critiques the nature of slavery. So the initial release of Vertigo compared to the status of Vertigo right now is that kind of disjuncture. And we look back and we're like, how could people in 1958 not have seen Vertigo as the incredible moment of inflection in cinema? And yet that is the case. So the plot of Vertigo is very complicated. It's about a guy who's obsessed with a woman who he thinks is a ghost, but turns out to be a liar. So the opening credit sequence, designed by Saul Bass, this famous graphic designer, designed the AT&T Death Star. Developed the credits, and you'll see it's got all kinds of references to modernist graphic design. But the point of it is Kim Novak's body is presented fragmented, fetishized. So anyone want to take a crack at that? How would you think about that in relationship to the kind of feminism that's being deployed in Takeoff, in Lucy's presentation of the fragmentation of women's body, in Freud's understanding of fetishism as a male neurotic processing of the women's body? So I want you to think about how many films begin with eyeballs. Man with the Movie Camera, the eyeball as a metaphor of cinema, 1929, Soviet Union. Blade Runner, 1982. The replicants arrive on Earth. And the first thing that we see is they open their eyes as they descend from heaven to the earth where they were created. Buñuel's Un Chien Andalou begins with the creator of the film, Luis Buñuel, slitting a woman's eye open. He actually slits a sheep's eye open and used a cheat cut to get it to happen. So cinema is seeing. It is an eye machine. So self-reflexive cinema, cinema which refers to itself, like what is a movie doing, is interested in eyeballs. But out of the woman's eyeball comes a spiral. I don't know, you or your kids in the 70s might have had a spirograph. You put a pencil on top of a little piece of plastic and you make these spirals. This is Susan from Bringing Up Baby. It's chaos. There's linear order, like a line, A to B, causality, simplistic, male causality. If you're, in a heterosexual relationship, my wife says to me, I'm upset about something. I'm like, what? Well, you should know. We have this circular conversation that takes, 45 minutes. And then once the truth is revealed through this crazy spiral, my immediate reaction, which if you write the handbook of how to be a husband, page 1 is, don't say, what do you want me to do about it? linear male thinking, right? Like, okay, so I've identified a problem. One of the things that's usually going on there is, I don't want you to do a damn thing about it because you're an idiot and you're partly responsible for the problem in the first place. I just want to rant and have you listen to me for once. All of that is expressed in this image. Spiralness is not the same as linear causality. Conventional men, myself included, seem to be pre-programmed by patriarchal civilization to be problem solvers. Tell me what the hell's wrong and I'll try to fix it. That's, of course, an incredibly stupid way of proceeding with the world, because most problems are not solvable at all. Our hubris is we can solve them. So this is what's loaded into this image. But what you study in Bringing Up Baby about the rational and the irrational is embedded here. All right, so that's one way of thinking. When I teach just one film to explain feminist filmmaking of the 1970s, not driven by liberal feminism, but driven by radical feminism, I show Sally Potter's film Thriller. It's her first film. It's a short, 30 minutes long. And if you know Ed Benyes, every time I meet him, he beats me to death with the fact that I showed our opera and film students this film. He's like, it could have been made by a third grader. I'm like, it wasn't made by a third grader. It was made by a brilliantly talented 25-year-old feminist filmmaker who would go on to become an incredibly important international filmmaker of feature films that played in movie theaters. So we start with The Reckless Moment for a screening, classical Hollywood film, melodrama. Then we watch a Woody Allen movie. Here's a pedophile, sexist asshole, but makes another woman. If I had to show a film about what it means for a film to have a central female character about whom you care intellectually, she's a philosophy professor. She's trying to process Rilke. She's in this marriage to an idiot. And she's forced to confront, what do you do when you're married to an idiot? And the third film in our little screening list is Orlando, Sally Potter's adaptation of Virginia Woolf's novel about transsexuality. It's not the contemporary transsexuality that we're grappling with right now. It's an intellectual hypothesis. So the plot of Orlando is a character undergoes a transformation in anatomy for no reason. At one moment, the character's a woman, and then another moment, she's a man. So it destabilizes history. It destabilizes the novel. Like one of the things that distinguishes novels, say Dickens novels, from the rest of 19th century literature. Most of British literature was mostly written by women. Jane Eyre is called Jane Eyre because it's about Jane Eyre. It's not about Rochester. And David Copperfield's called David Copperfield because it's about David Copperfield. The so-called Bildungsroman a novel about the growing to adulthood of a character. And I just want you to count the Bildungsroman, and they're almost all about boys. Huckleberry Finn is a Bildungsroman. How does Huck Finn learn the world is corrupt because seemingly Christian people support slavery? Huck knows it's wrong. He already knows it's wrong at the beginning of the movie. He's like, I got to get out of here. Aunt Polly's making me go to school. School does not seem correct. And then he floats on the boat with Jim and he learns what slavery is. And at the beautiful last moment of that novel, he says, I have to light out for the country, meaning I have to go west where the lunatics aren't. Now there's counterexamples. The Wizard of Oz is a Bildungsroman about a teenage girl. But the fact of the matter is that central female characters tend to be victimized. Most obviously in patriarchal genres like horror movies. Any girl who has sex in a horror movie is going to get stabbed 5 minutes later. And in opera, most of the plots of operas are about women who sing beautifully so that they can die. The most obvious joke, the reductionist joke about opera is it ain't over till the fat lady sings. But what she's singing about is her own death. Isolde in Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. And most famously, Mimi in Puccini's La Boheme. And I want to preface this with the fact that I wouldn't have taught opera and cinema with Ed Benyus unless I loved opera. So I had the students read this book by Catherine Clement. It's a feminist critique of opera. It was written in the 1970s, and it uses the same new French feminisms that Lucy uses in her book, and a whole bunch of other female scholars use in literary studies. There's this book by Susan Guber. It's a complete feminist reformulation of literary history. They're all written in the 80s using the radical feminist theory of the 70s. So I'll show you the ending of Thriller, and we'll talk a little bit about what makes it a feminist film. So the plot of La Boheme is Mimi is a seamstress, and she's dying of consumption because she lives in a freezing cold apartment. And in the same apartment building live these 4 guys who are all artists. They're bohemians. One of whom is Rodolfo, a painter. And in the first act, through this beautiful sequence of musical numbers, an aria by Mimi and an aria by Rodolfo, and then they sing together in a duet as they fall in love. That's the first act of La Boheme. It might be the most beautiful moment in Western art. It's certainly the most beautiful moment in opera. And then Mimi dies of consumption. And so it allows tragic laments in the final act. Woman's suffering creates great art. Both Puccini's La Boheme itself, if Mimi doesn't die, you don't get beautiful music out of it. And within the narrative, when Rodolfo watches Mimi die, he goes off to become a great painter because he now has suffering to paint about. So Mimi in Sally Potter's Thriller from 1979 is played by a Franco-African woman, which is already screwing around with stuff. We have no indication that Mimi in 1890s Paris is Franco-African. It could be. And it's a modernist Pirandello play. Pirandello's most famous play, Six Characters in Search of an Author, 1922. The actors and the characters wake up and have a fight with each other. The actors are like, we're more important. And the characters are like, no, we're more important. That's what's happening here. There's Mimi 1 and Mimi 2. Mimi 1 is up in the attic, and she's reading a French post-structural feminist journal, Tel Quel. And you'll see at first she laughs and it's ridiculous. And the reason it's called Thriller is she comes to the conclusion that Puccini has murdered her. And Potter uses Bernard Herrmann's strings from Psycho to say that she's been murdered.
You were immersed in the text.
So she's reflecting in voiceover the opera that she's in this attic. For whatever magical properties it has, it's awoken her to the fact that she's a victim of patriarchy.
I turned away from language, became silent, and was carried from the attic, frozen. What were you thinking of? I was searching for a theory that would explain my life. Was a clue to my death written in their text. Il y a quelque temps, pouvait paraître une théorie de la littérature.
So that's Tel Quel, and you'll hear French symbolic poetry of the 19th century, Mallarmé. You'll hear Freud. You'll hear the theoretical armature you need to analyze textual material, films, operas, literature, from a feminist point of view. It's all in French. I'll give you the gist of it at the end.
En rappelant l'acquis du formalisme lié à la naissance du structuralisme, indiquait après coup le lieu d'une réécriture dans l'approche du texte littéraire. Les trois mots que l'on vient de lire entre guillemets se sont depuis singulièrement déportés par rapport à ceux qui se trouvent soulignés plus haut. Il ne faudrait pas en conclure qu'un dépassement du littéral, du formel ou du structural se produit maintenant par une mutation simple. Plus profondément, il nous semble, pour marquer ici une opération vérifiable, aussi bien dans l'histoire scientifique, qu'un remaniement de base se fait toujours non sur le coup qui précède immédiatement celui de la refonte, mais sur le coup qui précède ce coup. C'est ainsi que pour préciser la dimension historique de ce qui arrive, il nous faut remonter au-delà des faits situables dans les années 1920-1930. Surréalisme, formalisme, extension de la linguistique structurale, pour placer correctement une réserve plus radicale inscrite à la fin du siècle dernier, Lautréamont, Mallarmé, Marx, Freud.
So she reads this theory journal and laughs the same way my students laugh. Why did you give me this complicated thing that reads like nonsense? I'm like, because the world is complicated and you need complicated theoretical ideas to understand it. But without a real education that gets you there, that seems laughable. And watch what happens now. She laughs as ridicule.
Oh, wait. The clue.
So Mimi too, from off space, from not in the image, but as voiceover, as ethereal presence, solves the murder.
Suddenly I understand. There was me in the opera and there was me in the attic. Act 1. There is a knock at the door. It is Mimi, a seamstress and flower maker, sewing.
So she retells the plot of the opera not as an art object, but as a feminist discourse.
Satin flower who didn't smell after all, often until the early hours working with a cold and a candle as companions. They produce story to disguise how I must produce their goods. Act 4. Suddenly, Musetta rushes in, bringing Mimi with her, who is dying. They lay her on the bed, they do what they can for her, but Mimi dies. And what if my husband died? Without my death, my love with Rodolfo might have borne children. I would have become a mother. I would have had to work even harder to give them food. But the heroine of such a story doesn't just labor day and night to feed those children. And if they had let me live, I would have become an old woman, and an old seamstress would not be considered the proper subject of a love story. I had to be young, single, and vulnerable, with a death that serves their desire to become heroes in the display of their grief. The pious resignation with which I accepted my life was synonymous with my death. If Musetta had died, it would not have been considered a tragedy, for she was an easy woman, a bad girl. We were set up as opposite and complementary characters and kept apart to serve our roles. Yes, it was murder.
Okay, so O Suave Fanciulla is one of the great duets in the history of opera. Rodolfo and Mimi sing together, O Lovely Girl. And it's the quintessence of love in a patriarchal world. And what Thriller does is it takes that aesthetic beauty and doesn't destroy it, but it constrains it. It says that's one thing that it is. And what's really powerful about the movie is that we want opera as a total experience, what Wagner calls the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. It's beautiful sound and beautiful image and beautiful staging and beautiful acting and beautiful singing and beautiful music playing or instrumentalization. What Thriller does is say, I will deconstruct it. You'll get the beautiful sound, but it'll annoy you because you're getting these grainy black and white photographs. That's not opera. Opera is sumptuous. It's what you see on the stage of the Met. And so the moment when Mimi One in the attic reads Telltale, laughs, what happens is that her laughter changes from ridicule to feminist interrogation.
I can.
And this is,
Well, I'm okay, but I hear Phil isn't doing too well.
you meet people, sorry. You-
Is he in ICU or is he in a hospital room? He's in ICU. Okay. That's clear on that.
I think you can mute her, right?
I'm trying.
And you said he's getting better. What is improvement?
Walter, I've got to leave because I've got another appointment to go to.
Okay.
Sorry.
So, all right.
Uh-huh.
Oh, wait.
Oh, good. He's getting physical therapy too.
Sorry.
I knew he had trouble.
Gonna end class here. People are hanging around me, yelling at me. I'll start class next week, finishing analyzing this film. Watch Orlando, and I'll see you next Wednesday at 1:30, okay?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Walter.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
They're trying to get it to skilled nursing facility.
Yeah,
And so far, no luck.
okay. I guess they're trying that of course. The field, but are they full up?
He said no,
Uh-huh.
requires too much care.
Too much care, yeah. Now, most of their patients don't, you know, Mary Schmidt is there now, and she's having trouble walking. Her knee gave out, and she's dealing with that. She may have surgery to replace the knee, but in the meantime, she's in Matterport, and that she can manage with a wheelchair. So does Phil use a wheelchair?
Well, the problem is getting him in the wheelchair.
Right, I got you, yeah. Well, I'm sorry, Tim, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to say he doesn't deserve this. He worked hard all his life. I wish he could enjoy retirement, but anyway, we'll try to get him back, you know, healing and get him out of there. I have a bag of some good reading material. I don't know if he's even interested in reading, but I thought if somebody could get it over there to him, at least it gives him a choice of a couple of things to read.
If he's up, please, I can probably do that.
Okay, when do you want to come by? Give me an idea. I mean, you know, so
I'm going back over there, probably around 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock, okay, so you'll be here between, what, that one, between 5:45 and 6, or between 5:30 and 6? I'll have everything ready by 5:30.
Okay. Yeah, he loves the cars, by the way.
Oh, good. That car got there, that's pretty good, because you don't have to go to St. Louis. You know, when you mail things, it goes to St. And I enclosed it, did he show you what I enclosed? It's an actual document. When I was an election judge, we were actually voting on whether we wanted to have a massage parlor. And they had a place for it. It was gonna be at the end of Glenview near Main Street.
Yeah.
And then you had to vote on 2 questions, yes or no. You saw that.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't believe that. So that was the most hysterical thing. We've never had anything like that before or since, and probably never will.
I would hope.
Yeah, it was voted down. I mean, besides, you know, people get massages. I used to get them all the time. They're very helpful, but this was really clearly was a different time. You know, the happy ending. You know that. You know. Oh God, that was crazy. Well, listen, I'll be ready for, you know, I'll have everything ready. It's just one bag. It's manageable. It has handles, so you can manage it. Okay, thank you. I appreciate you coming by for that.
Well, I appreciate you giving the reading material. Thank you.
Well, you're more than welcome. Yeah. Well, I know Ben probably has been there a lot, and I think Dan Smoot was there too. Yeah.
I did, he did there, that.
Right. Well, does it do, I know, I have his ring number, I wrote it, it's up 458, is that right, 458?
438.
438, okay. And if you call, does he use is it a hospital phone, or because he doesn't have a
Yeah,
phone? Mhm.
right, it will, but he can't reach it very well most of the time, so, I could let you know when I'm there, so I can pick it up for him.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean, you know, some of those things you can't reach. I guess other things are on his bed that moves and he can reach them, right? Does he have a TV in his room?
Yeah, but he hasn't really been watching it.
Oh, okay. Well, I know it's hard. It's hard for you especially, and I'm sorry about that.
One day at a time.
That's a good viewpoint. It really is one day at a time. Okay, well, I'll see you later today then, and of course, please tell him I said hi, and I'll talk to him later. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay, then, take care.
you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.